Let's welcome Ben Weinheimer.
Well, good afternoon, and Dr. Cleary, thank you for the great introduction, and I really appreciate all of our presenters this afternoon have helped set the stage. I will have to tell you a little bit. When Dr. Clear invited me to come, he said, don't worry, it'll be like hosting the CMTs. I've looked around all in the back for Kelsey Ballerini and Thomas Rhett, but there's no sign of them. They gave me Frank and Brian and Matt as my co-hosts. So with that, it's been a great afternoon of programming and a great opportunity for learning, I think, on all of our behalf. So we very much appreciate you being here. And on behalf of the organizations that I'm speaking to you from today, both the Texas Cattle Feeders Association and the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, I hope that we can further demonstrate to you that we do, in fact, own this word, sustainability. Now, with that, I guess we're about to eat dinner here shortly, so I'm going to help you out for just a little bit. And if you would, everybody just stand up for a second. It'll help expend, somewhere around 5 to 10 calories. You're going to consume slightly more than that here in a little bit in what we term here on the campus All Meat Monday. So if you're happy about that, and if you're proud of the role that you play in producing cattle and beef in a traditional way, not in a fake sense, give yourselves a round of applause. And just two more questions before you do sit down. And one is, if you're thankful that it's me up here in front of this large crowd, give yourselves a round of applause. Because it does take a little bit here to get rolling. And lastly, I would ask you that more than anything, thank you for what you do, and thank your neighbors for what you do. And as we dive into this topic, I want to thank all of you. So thank you. A little bit more about my background. So I was born on a farm and ranch just east of Amarillo, Texas. Farmed and raised mostly stocker cattle there with 6 other brothers, 3 of which still run our family operation there. And then I've had the opportunity the last 20 plus years to work for the Cattle Feeders Association and help them navigate a number of issues, including a lot of regulatory issues, as well as create several feed yard service programs for our members to utilize. So that's really what also through kind of that level of understanding of the cattle feeding sector, coming from a farm and ranch background, not having so much knowledge about the packing sector and the retail sector, but understanding a lot about the front end of the supply chain is what really piqued my interest in this whole sustainability work. So as we have heard a lot about this today, the attacks on our industry as we know them today have continued and likely will continue going into the future. We've, whether it be plant-based burgers or vegan burgers, as Dr. Mitloner just rightly suggested, as well as the attack that we hear every day relative to our environmental impact. Now, what can we do about it, and what have we done about it to try to tell a better story and to get the facts out there about what the U.S. beef production system is? We continue to utilize good science, whether that's through all of the research that's conducted here at Texas A&M and the other land-grant universities. We've engaged influencers, Frank being obviously a great spokesperson from his research perspective, as well as many of our AgriLife Extension folks who have helped us throughout not just this conference, but help us throughout the industry to be influencers, not just to ourselves as producers, but also to consumers. We're able to collaborate together. And through that collaboration, we continue to demonstrate that we care, that we strive to be the best, and that collectively we can work to build and improve consumer trust. So this is really what we've viewed our charge to be as we're trying to take what has become somewhat of a very compartmentalized and fragmented supply chain to put it back together all the way from the cow-calf producer to the retailers, and each person and entity in that supply chain be able to communicate the good things that they're doing to produce safe, wholesome beef in a very productive and efficient way. That led us here about 4 years ago, and I'll leave out some of the more boring kind of lead-up arguments and discussions that occurred in the industry. But about 4 years ago, we in the cattle feeding industry many of the organizations that represent y'all as well in the cow-calf sector, and through the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, finally realized that it was time to really step up and take ownership of this term and do it in a way that was meaningful to us, but yet reasonable. So through that, in 2014, we formed this organization. We launched it in 2015. It operates with the mission to advance, support, and communicate continuous improvement in the sustainability of U.S. beef production. We engage the entire supply chain. I mentioned that. I'll show you a graphic here in a minute of all the entities that currently make up this group. And then the vision at the bottom to absolutely be the trusted global leader. And you know, key words there in terms of trusted and global. We are and we will continue to be that trusted global leader. This is just one additional way for us to demonstrate that we do that through a variety of different practices and approaches that we take in different segments of the supply chain. This is the graphic that really illustrates what the group has done in terms of a roadmap and tried to focus on developing this coordinated effort. So engagement of all the stakeholders throughout the supply chain has become number one. That's the strong foundation that has allowed us to accomplish thus far what we've done to, say, reunite the supply chain. We've worked on a beef industry sustainability framework. I'll share some of the highlights with you about what that means and how we've taken that down to the individual operational level, totally on a voluntary basis. This is not a command and control or a mandated approach whatsoever. And then a couple other elements on communication and project support to help demonstrate proof of concept. The last thing that I'll call out on this slide is that you'll see at the bottom where we've termed it external opportunities. So the Roundtable as a group, it doesn't own cattle, it doesn't enter into marketing agreements, it doesn't sit in corporate boardrooms. It collectively brought together all of the stakeholders of the supply chain to agree on what our message needs to be about beef sustainability, but it doesn't make marketplace decisions. So we've built these tools and resources on the top end of this graph and then leave it in the hands of the individual supply chain partnerships and those arrangements between whether that's a retailer and a packer to a feed yard and so on, to utilize it to the extent that they deem most appropriate. That's an important point of understanding to ensure that we leave that to the business-to-business relationships. This currently represents the members of the Roundtable today. So there's approximately 120 members on that slide. In Dr. Clear's opening remarks, he indicated that we have touch points with approximately 100 million beef consumers. So just as a test of that, if you see that top row on the slide that indicates all the retail and food service entities that have actively engaged in this conversation. If you've shopped and bought groceries there, if you've pulled through the fast food drive-through, or you've gone into one of these restaurants, raise your hand. All of us. The key point, and of course this sector, if you will, this segment, different words that we use for the same thing, that continues to grow. You see definitely some of the big brands that are up there, and we've continued to see more and more interest from some of the other retail and food service brands. But nonetheless, those alone already represent about 100 million beef consumer touch points for us to be able to communicate what we're doing. The next level is our packers and processors. All of the major packing companies in the country are represented, still working there as well to grow some interest from some of our regional packers and even the smaller ones. And then those that are helping represent all of us and our voice in the live animal, the cattle segment of the supply chains, the producers, whether that's cow-calf producers, stocker operators, auction markets, feed yards, all of us fall into that producer category. Thankfully, as you look at that slide, and with a lot of hard effort early on to ensure that the producers in the country were well represented, about 50% of the membership is made up of cattle producers or cattle producer organizations. That's been a strong point. It's been something where you can ensure that throughout all of these conversations, your voice has been heard loud and clear to keep this reasonable and meaningful and not create something that's just an additional mandate, if you will, that you would have to deal with. The last two tiers, the allied industry folks, many of them are represented in the trade show. We know how important they are in supporting all of our industries to help meet our needs. And then the last category down here in the bottom under civil society, you have a combination of both our university partners, research institutes, a few of the what we would term non-governmental organizations, so the conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited as a couple of examples. This has already been touched on. I didn't, I highlighted it for the retailers when their slide was up there, but that big section in the middle of the cattle producers, those members represent about 30% of the cattle in the country, and then the packers and processors, because the major packers are all represented, that's about 80% of the beef processed in the U.S., that 20 billion pounds. So next, we'll start, took you through the engagement piece of it and how we put this group of members together. And as I leave that point, mind you, this continues to be an open membership organization. You can go to the website, take a look at it if you have an interest. The producer price of admission, if you will, is much less than the retailers and the packers and processors, and that's intentional. That's in part why we were able to get that large producer representation. And it's a very simple membership form if you have interest in having more engagement with this roundtable. So next, we'll talk about the framework itself and how we went through that process to develop and put parameters on exactly what are we talking about. The historic reference here is just to let you know that it's taken a lot of time, energy, and focus to keep this herd of cats, and in this case, this herd of cattle moving in the same direction. You realize that many of the big brands have big voices when it comes to these meetings and discussions, and we've helped build relationships with many of them and have an open and trustful conversation about what's in the best interest of all of us that are raising cattle and processing beef. So that said, this is the formation days. We went through, and I'll give you a little bit of a real high level discussion on what these mean in terms of high priority indicators, the metrics that have been developed, some assessment guides, and then recently, what's termed this framework launch is this collective package over the past 3 years that was developed kind of on a year-by-year basis. We just finalized this in May of this year. So this is all kind of fresh. The ink is still drying on some of these documents. The other two things that we've done, and we may or may not have much time to talk about them today, but we've launched a recognition program that allows the roundtable to accept applications from existing programs and have those reviewed so that they can demonstrate that their programs already align with what these indicators and metrics are discussing. That's important because we're not about just reinventing the wheel and trying to create something from scratch. If there's a lot of this that's already being done in a certain segment of the supply chain and a company or an organization, an association already has something that covers the gamut of what's being discussed here, then by all means we want them to apply for that recognition and say, hey, you're already doing it. We understand and recognize that. The last thing that I think you'll find interesting is that there's a self-assessment tool. It's just gone live in the past week. So those web addresses, and if you just Google U.S. beef sustainability, the roundtable hit comes right up near the top, if not the very top of the list. And there's a link on there that takes you to a self-assessment tool. Again, we'll touch on that depending on how much time we have. So this is what constitutes the framework. First, this discussion around, well, what is this definition that we're talking about when it comes to beef sustainability? Second, then, is if you've defined that and you've agreed on it, then what are these areas that are most important for this whole supply chain to focus on? Because there are a lot of different topics of interest to folks, and we had to whittle that down to something that was agreeable to the entire group. We've developed then some metrics where each sector of the supply chain took those areas of importance and came back to the roundtable with what they felt that they could contribute. So these were all developed from within by each sector of the supply chain. These were not mandated up and down as perhaps some other initiatives have attempted to do. And then the last part is just to provide some guidance documents around further helping people understand what this means and how to implement it. So the first aspect of that in terms of this framework is this definition. You can look at those three key words as a lot of the focal point comes these days when you talk about sustainability or hear it talked about. It addresses the environment, addresses people, and addresses economics. Now, what I've done is, and what I prefer about this definition is the second sentence where I've underlined a couple of key words. It definitely means that we must be profitable, farmers and ranchers and businesses. We're committed to optimizing resources and caring not only for the animals, but also for the environment, our employees, and of course, we're big rural America, and cattle producers are a big part of our rural communities. So all those logically fit together is something that we can embrace and something that we take a lot of pride in every day. The next piece of this is, and again, just to familiarize you with some of the words, but this indicator concept, as I mentioned and like to refer to it, it's just more about what are those key areas of importance that the whole supply chain agreed to work on. When we first started into this exercise, we had about 75 people that represented all of those members, sat around in a room for a day. They put up 160 different topics, 160. Now there was no way in the world, and I could use some other almost phrases that Frank used, but there was no way in the world that we were actually going to get to any type of agreement around 160 topics, or at least spend that much time on those. So we whittled that down, and collectively we grouped these together. We put them in buckets where things were common and could be addressed. So you see the top three, these are not in order of priority. They're just up there the way that we're taken out of the report. In part, they're up there because the one that we started with as a group we thought would be easiest. We started with water resources. So that's where we started and then worked our way down. So water resources, land resources, air and greenhouse gases. As you heard Dr. Mitlerner just speak to that and the importance of how we're accurately messaging around what we do and do not contribute when it comes to greenhouse gases. Efficiency and yield, that's the term that's used here for conversations of how can we talk about making improvements, because no one in the world is going to put profitability up here as a measure that they have a willingness to share. So it's a surrogate measure for profitability, but it's something where we can, again, speak to the production practices and our improvement in production practices per unit of output per unit of input. And then the last two very much pillars of what we do every day, and that's caring for cattle. And the last one, a safe workplace. You know, this conversation is different when you're talking about it at the ranch level. It's very much around things like Dr. Gill teaches on stockmanship and stewardship. And then, of course, as you move up the supply chain into the packing plants, it's very much more a full, OSHA compliance type of employee safety program. So those are the 6 key areas. Behind each one of these then, we've had each of the sectors build out metrics or questions around what could they target towards a cow-calf producer, as an example, about relating each of these back to the ranch. So we simply went forward with that, and as I mentioned a minute ago, we started with water resources. So here you have the cow-calf sector, are the cow-calf producers that were represented, all of y'all, through these discussions. They came back and said, well, the grazing management plan is an important aspect of ensuring that we have proper forage management, soil health, soil quality, that we've got the right stocking densities, all those elements of an important and a complete grazing management plan. So that helps contribute to protecting and improving water resources. You'll see that same thing carried through with the auction markets and the feed yards. And then as you get into the packers and processors and the retailers, nobody was let off the hook. These guys came back with a little bit more complicated set of metrics because they can measure more quantitatively than we can at the ranch or at the feed yard level. So the packers and processors and the retailers alike, both developed a kind of a list of questions, and these levels, if you will, ask them questions about, do you have a plan to start? Do you have a way to measure it as level 2? And then level 3, to what extent you engage in other initiatives to further verify what you're doing, either as a packer or processor or as a retailer. This was their choice, just like these were our choice to bring forward as far as what we thought were the most identifiable things that we could contribute in a meaningful way. Here now, as I transition then specifically to the cow-calf sector, and I should say that we have a booth up in the trade show that has some of these handouts in it, so if you're interested in it, stop by and pick those materials up. But this is where, again, you come back to the cow-calf metrics in total. There's a significant focus on grazing management plans on addressing all three environmental areas, so that's land, water, and air, and all the benefits that grazing management provides those. Efficiency and yield, animal health and well-being, a focus on beef quality assurance principles and practices, which many of you have become BQA certified. And then the last one, again, more around stockmanship and stewardship to ensure that you're maintaining employee safety, and in this case, your own safety, because many times it's you or your spouse or your kids that are involved on the farm and ranch. That said, because of this emphasis here on grazing management plan, tomorrow afternoon at 1:30, we put together another breakout session. It's in your program. You'll see it. It's under the heading of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. The main part of that topic is not this presentation whatsoever. It's about what is included in a quality grazing management plan and how can you assess your plan today, and to the extent that you may have opportunities to make some changes to that. So the lead presenter there will be Hugh Aljo, Director of Producer Relations with the Noble Research Institute. He's going to take you through a whole workshop tomorrow afternoon starting at 1:30 in the Rudder Forum. It's also several reference materials in Section L of the proceedings. So I encourage you to take a look at those, and if you have an interest in this and learning more about that, Hugh does a great job walking people through this from kind of start to finish, if you will. This is just, the Noble Research Institute is just one example of those civil society members that I mentioned who have been great contributors to the Roundtable. You would have also saw on that slide, if you maybe you found it on there, the Texas A&M Department of Animal Science, King Ranch Institute, Colorado State, Kansas State, many of the big, well-recognized ag universities and research institutes have helped us develop some of this information that you'll see, as well as it's important that we rely on many of the trusted sources that our cow-calf producers go to today. So as I start to wrap up, I'm going to just touch on these last three things briefly, and mostly not to tell you how to do it, but just to drive you in the direction where you can find more information if you're interested. The first one is on a self-assessment tool. So this fits within the communication piece of how are we ensuring that this voluntary uptake, how do we encourage this voluntary uptake to occur? And the self-assessment tool is under the main website of beefsustainability.us. And off to the left-hand side there, you can click on the self-assessment tool. It'll ask you to pick, which sector you are actively engaged in. And then after walking you through a series of questions, and there's a mobile platform for this that's in the works that'll be even easier than using your desktop, but it gives you just a gauge of where you're at. This platform operates online, but it doesn't save anything. So, in terms of your ability to use it, the only thing, and we're actually probably going to get a little bit of criticism about this, the only thing it allows you to do, it allows you to save a PDF file, an Adobe Acrobat file for your own use. But that's intentional on behalf of the Roundtable and the discussions that we've had, that it's not our information. This is for your own use. You can do with it what you want. You can use it to identify areas where you're doing things very well, and likewise you can use it to identify areas where you'd like to study more and make some changes and improvements, much like you're doing here at this conference to come learn new information. The other couple of pieces that I'll mention here is supported projects. So as a way to further kind of vet and test these concepts. Many of the members have put together supply chain. Some of them are full supply chain pilot projects. Other of them just focus on research and education aspects. And then a couple of them have developed some, calculator tools to help people evaluate what they're doing within their own operations. So there's several supported pilot projects. There's write-ups of these on the website as well if you're interested in learning more about what their approach is. And then the last piece I want to take you to is kind of a line that fits right in here. So I mentioned to you earlier about how the marketplace side of the implementation is wholly a business-to-business conversation. It's not a roundtable driven discussion. And I also mentioned to you that we want to recognize the good things that companies and individuals and organizations are doing today. So through that effort, we tried to put the two together. How do we stay out of the supply chain, but yet how do we brag about many of the great things that are being done within the supply chain and call those out and draw some attention to those. So the process that has been developed, a fairly simple application, an individual or a company can fill that out online, submit that. Basically it's just asking you, tell us about your programs, how do you address land, water, and air, and animal health, and so on. And then that application goes through an outside independent review. So it's a decision not being made by any of the logos that you saw on the slide earlier. That's an external process. That independent reviewer will bring back a side-by-side comparison, and then they'll make a recommendation to say, yes, there's no need for this company or this individual or this organization to start from scratch. They already have many of the major elements covered. So we'll call out those programs on the website, and then again, it's up to that program or that company to decide what do they want to do with it from there. Is it just additional bragging rights to them, or do they want to try to create some type of full or larger chain communication aspects about what they're doing to address the sustainability of their operations? So ultimately, those approved programs, there's some going through the process currently. None of them are currently approved at this point. But they'll land on our homepage and be visible for people to see and as examples of some of the existing programs that already meet these areas of importance that have been identified. The last thing I'll mention to you is just, again, it is a member-driven organization. It's open membership. Again, if you do have an interest in that, by all means, catch me at the trade show booth or go to our website there, the Roundtable's website, study that information, and dig in a little deeper if it's something that interests you. Now what will be the 6th annual meeting is scheduled for April 28th through the 30th. Going to Florida this time. We've been moving it around to different parts of the country, trying to ensure that we geographically have some diversity from west to east and north to south. So we'll continue to do that as we go forward. That said, I'm going to stop there and let you all find your way to the prime rib. So thanks for the opportunity to be here.